And to understand that, you have to understand that Lacan is situated under two people that are regarding science and the difference between the modern world and the ancient world. That is Alexander Koyré and Alexander Kojève, the Hegelian. And so the way Milner sets this up is that for Koyré, there is a difference between the episteme of antiquity versus uh modern science, right? And that is because for episteme and even philosophy, it rested on theoria and praxis. Techne was not an important element. Technology or tools or experimentation as the fundamental basis for episteme. It isn't until the rise of Galileo and the Galilean science that we get an episteme or a science that conjoins episteme and techne together. And it is a difference between a cosmos that whose real is really the logos and the harmony of all celestial bodies that move around versus a decentered universe, one that is not only measured upon a mathematical model of the universe, one that's expanding and we can never know the fate of the universe, but also we're learning something new. And that's due to the technological precision that allows me to measure and literalize my understanding of the universe, right? And he kind of, and then you get Kojève, who says that there is a break between the ancient world and then the modern world, and that's because of Christianity, right? And so he lumps together Lacan's theorems, or Kojève and Koyré's theorems for Lacan's understanding, because this is what Lacan adheres to for most of his entire seminars. He says, insofar as it is distinguished from the ancient world, modern science is formed by Christianity. Since there is a distinction between Christianity and the ancient world, so Christianity comes from the sort of Prosaic law of Judaism, and then that modern science contains what is Judaic and what is Christian, meaning that there's still a law of the universe that we adhere to. That would be like the natural law that science adheres to for the modern universe. And so all that is modern is in sync with Galilean science, and there is nothing modern except that which is in sync with all Galilean sciences. Because what makes the Galilean science such it is that it's dealing with a modern mathematizable universe. And this is where we get the subject. This is where we get the
Yeah.
subject of science that I talked about in our beginning thing, which is the cogito, right? So not only do you get the modern universe with precision and techne and episteme, but you get the modern subject as such from the cogito, right? The res cogitans and res extensium. And he wants to talk about like this happens because of a fundamental break. And how we can understand that break is synonymous to what Foucault does. Foucault has a theory of archaeology, right? And you could learn about this archaeology in his Order of Things, and I think on the archaeology of knowledge. But I think the one that he focuses on more in that text is on the Order of Things. And what the archaeology does is to show that there are layers of discourse that represent a break. And while this seems to align with what Lacan's doing, Lacan is different from Foucault for this precise reason of discourse, because his discourse is not a historicist discourse like Koyré and Kojève, but not also dealing with the genealogy of a certain point of history in Foucault. But there is a heterogeneity to Foucault's breaks, but that's not a major break. The science from episteme to modern science is a major break that allows the subject of science to happen and psychoanalysis to happen. For Foucault, we only have a heterogeneous breaks. So the history of sexuality, which is very permissive and not repressive, has a break, which is because of the Christian paradigm. But that Christian paradigm does not relate to the break of civilization to madness, right? So these are heterogeneous breaks. These do not relate to any one and another, right? And that even says that like the language that we use now for Foucault is way different from other discourses prior to this break. So it's no coincidence that we see words like madness and prison exist simultaneously and same because of this heterogeneous break. But he cannot account for the Galilean science because he would only see Galilean science not as a modern science as such, but only a specific break from another form of natural science or natural philosophy, right? For Lacan, because of where he's adhering to, he's able to account for this major break that accounts for not only all multiplicity of discourses, but all multiplicity of discourses adhere to a major break, right? And so, two one thing. So before we get into the whole language thing and how that changes over time, there is actually something interesting that Milner points out that Lacan and Foucault are both doing, even though they have different ideas of a break. What they're trying to combat against is a specific essay written by Stalin, right? So there's not only Stalin the bureaucrat, we have Stalin the theorist. And Stalin wrote this essay in 1950 or like 1953 called Marxism and Language or Marxism and Linguistics, to which he says that because Marxists are always dealing with infrastructure and like the base and the superstructure, right? Yeah. And so
Superstructure, yeah.
for Joseph Stalin, he's saying that language has no effect on the base and superstructure. So any changes on the base and superstructure don't affect language, and any changes in language are independent of base and superstructure. So what that means is that language is allergic, or language has no connection to changes in base and superstructure, meaning that language is allergic to revolution as such, which is also problematic for Marxists because that means that we could jettison the dictatorship of the proletariat and we don't have to worry about all these other things that are not ideological because they have no effect on the base and superstructure, and so we get rid of class struggle and we privilege bureaucracy. And Foucault was an anti-Stalinist, so that's why he showed that for his breaks, language changes within infrastructural changes. So language changed from the history of sexuality and antiquity to the language of guilt in Christianity and repression, and also the language changed from early civilization to the one of a regime of madness and the prison and the clinic. We have different regimes and different languages and different classifications. But surprisingly, Lacan will take uh, something synonymous with Stalin only to kind of invert it because when he talks about Roman Jakobson, he's actually also talking about Stalin because Roman Jakobson would kind of have a similar thing to say that language has its own laws, right? Independent of any sort of social, infrastructure or whatnot. But the reality is that really language can only have that sort of reference point because it has to be accounted for as the break, and something that could survive a break is mathematics, right? Mathematics is something that could account for the break. And so mathematics and mathematical language and linguistics are sciences that can account for the break because they existed prior to the break, but now can be scientificized by the break of modern science itself as a new reference. Yeah,
The
as a new
Galilean
reference point.
break, yeah.
But that's because we're not dealing with language as an object of science, nor mathematics as an object of science as such. We're dealing with the subject of science who was able to be a vanishing mediator and account for itself from these mathematical models. So this really accounts for why in Lacan's relationship to science, or science as a core doctrine, because really the core doctrine is a fundamental fantasy, to be able to create the perfect theory, to be able to have the perfect ideal science with the ideals to map out the entire universe, to have the big toe of everything, to be able to unite letter with nature and man and woman. At least for psychoanalysis, the fundamental fantasy of science is man and woman, same, being able to have that sexual relation. And so this is what he's getting at. And so the linguistic model ultimately fails because also even the theory of the break has a historicist thing. So the second classicism is the matem, the theory of the discourse, which is able to map out a break in a non-chronological and in a non-historicist way. So the theories of the discourse are actually a mathematical topological way to scientifically, or somewhat of a scientific way, map out the subject of science onto discourse and to account for with the way that the discourses shift how psychoanalysis structurally inaugurates. So this is exactly what Milner is showing. Lacan's relationship to science is not that he cares about science as such, but that there is a sort of core doctrine and unconscious discourse within mathematics that only modern science and a lot of these debates and everything that were going around regarding science and even the emphasis of language and mathematics can finally bring up something along the lines of formal minimalism, which Lacan can use to talk about an unconscious structure like a language, but it isn't written like a regular language. It's written like a mathematical formalism, right? So that is pretty much what the Milner book is trying to show.
I mean, is this why Lacan, almost notoriously uses like knot theory and all of this mathematical notation when he speaks of psychoanalysis?
Yes, because when you map out
Indeed,
not yeah,
indeed.
and when you map out knots or when you draw them out, it's not one continuous thread. They are different strokes that have convergences and to create different structures. And with that, you have small gaps. And within these gaps or vectors, this is where you get the unconscious real, right? The real is like that which like sort of resists the symbolization.
The,
Yeah,
the
but
gap.
it's also where the unconscious is, where language and writing fail.